perspective wise as a human, that when we sweat or when we're huffing and puffing during a workout, that means that it's a good workout. Now, here's the thing I will want to remind you. That does not mean that is the only sign of a good workout. All right, what is up, everybody? Episode 13, A Pursuit of Balance. We're going to talk about how to structure your cardio in your aerobic training or anaerobic training. We're going to get into a little bit of aerobic threshold and VO2 max work and talk about heart rate variability a little bit. This is a big thing that I think a lot of us, and myself included in this conversation, tend to overlook with the training. And this is probably, I would say, more towards the strength community more than anybody. But then again, I think it just goes for a lot of people just that aren't even training at all. But for most people probably listening to this, you're probably either in functional lifestyles already or have some form of training going on. And, this was actually kind of just a little like outside planning with a client of mine. And I was telling her, I was like, hey, what I want you to do is just like after your workouts twice a week, like let's add some type of aerobic stuff, right? And the question she had was like, well, how would I structure, like an aerobic plan or a cardio plan? And that's obviously what I want to kind of share with you guys is kind of like, what is the approach that someone should be taking for cardio, right? Now, a lot of us understand, we think about, okay, like we know cardio is good for, heart health, cardiovascular health, longevity, like all these conversations that fall in part of it, weight loss, obviously being a big one, the caloric burn from it, or obviously something more sports specific for some of us, right? So like we have a handful of people training for a high rocks competition in December from the gym, and that's very endurance based. I just went to 2 weekends in a row of doing triathlons, or not me doing them, but supporting other people that are doing them. And, so I think it's a big part of the conversation, but I think sometimes we get a little lost in the sauce of like, how am I actually structuring my planning around it, right? And I think when you look at cardio, right, like obviously most of us think about, like I talk about this in the gym with like conditioning work, right? I always say we're a movement-based strength and conditioning, right? Strength and conditioning is kind of like the foundation of like, let's get you stronger via body weight, via strength training, and then conditioning being kind of more of what most people would think is the cardio element. And then we also, the movement-based is just kind of the approach to the training and exercise selection itself. So the conditioning for what we do in functional lifestyles, like in the way that I always kind of approach it and sell it on the front end for people that are joining, is like our conditioning is going to be a lot more intense and a lot shorter in duration, right? And most of the training and things that I would like people to do are going to be more aerobic or easy pace and like easy conversation, right? So an easy rule of thumb is we kind of think about there's 0 through 5 zones of training, right? And there is a lot of context to this, right? Like, the very easy elementary version that a lot of us think about when we think about heart rate is like, oh, it's 220 minus my age, right? So it's like if I'm a 30-year-old, 190 beats per minute would be my max heart rate. And then I would do my percentages based off that. So zone 5, to kind of start from the top, we're thinking about the 90 to 100% of your max heart rate, right? And then zone 4 would be 80 to 90. Zone 3 would be 70 to 80. Zone 2 would be 60 to 70. Zone 1, I'm losing my math, 50 to 60. Zone 0 being anything under 50%. For most people in the beginning of their training journey, or that have had a lot of time without any type of conditioning work or cardiovascular training, you'll be surprised how low level effort you think it is to actually get to some of the zones that we're actually trying to get to people, right? So a lot of times we hear about zone 2 work, or a lot of times we hear about HIIT training, which is your high intensity interval training. In running, I had a running coach when I was in school that always said like zone 3 was kind of like the dead man zone, right? It's like, not that it's bad. There's no bad heart rate necessarily. But it's like, in order to really get in the macro point of view, if you were to zoom out a little bit, the most benefit from our training, we want to have a nice balance of majority of our work being kind of in these lower level zone 2 work, and obviously exposing ourselves to maybe about 30 minutes of this zone 4, zone 5 type of work. And it's even been interesting too, because like some of the, like I've been wearing Whoop again for the last probably 3 weeks, and I wore it for almost 3-4 years and kind of took a couple years off of it. And they do obviously their calculations a little bit different, because there is a handful of ways to go about how to find the correct zones, and like what are the things that also influence it. Your resting heart rate is going to be like, I think Whoop goes off that formula, is actually what they use their kind of formula based off, meaning like if you are a very conditioned person, right, meaning like you have good aerobic capacity, or you are someone that's consistently running, biking, swimming, doing some type of cardio, you're naturally going to probably have a lower resting heart rate, which is going to mean that it's going to be at a lower heart rate for you to get into certain zones based off that formula, right? So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds of the formula stuff because A, not only is I think it's confusing for most people to understand, but B, I don't really think that you need to be worrying about that because the way that you would probably be tracking yourself anyways would be off technology, and technology is going to give you their formula. So it doesn't matter if you're using a Whoop or using a Garmin, it doesn't matter if you're using Oura Ring, an Apple Watch, like there's so many things as far as technology goes. And just like tracking and nutrition, I will say this. I think there is a lot of value if you want to get very detailed with your programming and your approach to your cardiovascular training, which I'm going to obviously talk about today. But there's also ways to do it just more intuitively that don't require you having technology, right? And I use the nutrition as an example because, like, yeah, tracking calories or weighing food or whatever kind of, system you have in place to be able to track those things is down to a very detailed science. Still a little nuanced because you can never be 100% accurate at that. But then there's also ways to like change the food quality and the food selection and how you eat to also manage calories effectively as well. So, that's where I kind of go back and forth always with clients is like trying to meet you where you're at of like, what is your style? A lot of people I will say in Silicon Valley, like we obviously inherently are, attached to our technology and we love the technology, which is great because it's going to make your life easier. But also there's a point that you need to become intuitive as well, right? So let's start with zone 2, right? Zone 2, I think, should be the foundation of everything. Well, if I were to even take a step back, I actually had this conversation 2 days ago with a new client, and she was like, is walking exercise? And I said, absolutely. And she goes, well, does that count? It was like when I was basically kind of telling her, she's like, she's had some time off from training and she wanted to start twice a week. And I was like, I'd really encourage you to probably think about maybe starting 3 times a week, unless you're doing something else by yourself. And she says, well, I'm walking, 8,000 steps a day. Does that count? And I said, yes and no. And let me explain that. If you're really, really deconditioned or not doing much at all, zone 2, like that heart rate zone, you might be getting there off some longer walks or some moderate pace walking, right? So that's where there's nuance. For someone that's a little bit better shape, that walking might not actually get them that exposure to those certain zones of heart rate. Like for me, it's like, I think right now, the last 3 weeks, just from Whoop, for example, I'm averaging about 12,000 steps a day. Those steps are rarely, if ever, getting me into a zone 2 kind of aerobic state, right? It's zone 0. I'm under 50% of my max heart rate, right? And that's because I'm in good enough shape for me to not really have my heart rate get that elevated based off something that, and I don't want to say, I do want to say it. Walking is easy, right? As far as relative effort goes, right? But it's not easy for everyone, right? If you've never worked out or you have a lot of weight to lose or you're a little bit older or, you live in elevation or you live around hills, there's obviously context items that are going to make walking harder. So I will say that even off all training or all mobility programming or strength conditioning, whatever we're talking about, walking should be the foundation of it, right? But to get back to the zone 2, zone 2 is really where we should be spending from a time perspective, the biggest chunk of our aerobic training or cardiovascular training, right? In zone 2, the easiest way on the intuitive side to understand this is 2 things. You should be able to hold the conversation the entire time you're doing this, right? So let's just say I go on a bike ride, right? So my wife and I sometimes on the weekend, we'll take the beach cruisers out and we'll bike all the way down to Los Gatos, get lunch and some drinks, bike back. And it's probably 30, 40 minutes maybe on the bike each way. If I can't hold a conversation, that means I'm working past the point of effort that is probably getting me into the zone 3 plus, right? So that's always like a good range to understand is like, okay, zone 2 or lower effort stuff, you should be able to do 2 things. Number 1, talk. Number 2, nasal breathing. Nasal breathing is always going to be a good kind of dictator too of also like, if I can't breathe through my nose, that also means I'm probably getting past that threshold where it's like, okay, now I need to start mouth breathing. And, the nasal breathing part of it, I think a lot of us here, like, okay, nasal breathing, something everyone talks about. There's even this things with mouth tape, a lot of nasal strip companies coming out. We understand the importance of nasal breathing for this parasympathetic perspective of recovery or stress management or just getting us out of this kind of sympathetic state. But you need to remember that mouth breathing is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because when you get to these really, really high exertion or high effort activities, You have to, just because of the amount of volume of breathing that you're going to be going through. So just understand that there is context. But zone two, the two things that you guys can use is obviously going to be, from a non-tech perspective, is going to be, can I nasal breathe and can I hold the conversation the whole time? Now, as far as like what you guys should be shooting for every week, the science shows right around 90 minutes, right? So I would say a minimum of 60 minutes up to 2 hours a week, but 90 minutes kind of being the sweet spot for us. So if you think about 90 minutes, like for some of us, like I said, if you're just starting off, that could be longer walks or more intense walks or hiking or things like that. For some of us that are in better shape, that's actually going to be more dedicated effort towards actual training. Now, the one thing about cardio too, I think I personally promote running probably the most because I think just from a movement perspective, it's probably one of the most fundamental and organic things that we're designed to do as bipedal creatures. So I really like running because it's going to force you to get into hip extension. It's going to force you to rotate a little bit. It's more unilateral. It's got a lot of stability. I will say there is kind of prerequisites for form. A lot of, actually the client that I was just talking about earlier, she was like, oh yeah, well, running is easy because like you don't really need to have good technique or form, or like it's just natural as humans. And I'm like, true. Like I do agree with that running is a natural thing, but not true because most people actually don't know how to run, right? So when you're going to pick the cardio option or modality for yourself, naturally, I would pick the one that is going to have the most benefit and B, probably the most enjoyment, maybe even putting enjoyment in front of it. So you think about this, like there's biking, there's rowing, there's skis, there's running, there's swimming, there's hiking, there's sports, skimboarding, surfing for me, mountain biking. Like there's so many different tools kind of in the bag that you can pick from. They're all, at the end of the day, your body's going to have a heart rate increase. And when we're talking strictly about the cardiovascular side of conversation, it doesn't matter the modality that your guys are using, right? So I do get that question of like, which one's best? And I'm like, well, A, like which one do you enjoy? And B, which one do you probably need? Now, here's one thing that I will say that is something that I kind of suggest being careful or aware of. If you're someone like the majority of the people that I work with that sit down for a living with their work professionally, or that drive a lot or sit down at home, naturally as just modern humans, I think we sit down more than we kind of always have, right? We're moving a lot less and we're sitting more. You got to remember this sit down position, right? Me sitting down in this chair doing this podcast, I'm sitting with my hips flexed, right? My shoulders are a little bit rounded forward, right? My core's off because I have back support. So there's some things like biking for me, or even some dimensions of sometimes rowing for people, where I will encourage them to think about sprinkling other modalities in too, right? Because running is going to be great for hip extension. It's going to be great for getting your arms and kind of mid back to rotate a little bit. All the things I just said. But also, like if you look at like a skier gets me nice and tall, gets me overhead. You think about swimming gets me overhead, so I get a little bit more shoulder flexion and extension. So I think from a mobility perspective, that's where the context lies, is like picking the aerobic activity that also is going to give you a return on investment maybe for other areas too, right? So if you are someone that has really tight hips or bad hips and ankles, like, yeah, you probably should be walking, hiking, and running a little bit more. Now, if you're someone that's never ran before, right, and I'll get into this a little bit later with the zone 4 and 5 stuff, I really would encourage you to make sure that you're taking it slow, because the cool thing about a bike, I think you can really gauge intensity, right? Rower, a little bit harder. You have to kind of sit upright versus being kind of relaxed on handlebars, right? Skier, aerodyne, like you can kind of control those variables. Running is one of those things that when you get like fatigued and you kind of become, and obviously that's going to be dictated by your conditioning level, your form can get pretty ugly pretty fast. And that's where it starts to come with other things that are going to obviously not be as beneficial for how you feel. So my knees are going to start hurting. I'm, obviously hearing people about shin splints or foot problems or lower back issues. So, that is the only thing when you guys are picking modality or picking the exercise selection, like just be aware of, right? So zone 2, like I said, that's going to be the aerobic. That's going to be the foundation, right? So for me, it's like, if I think about it from a running perspective, I'm going to use running a lot just because A, it's the thing I encourage, and B, the thing I personally probably like to use the most. These are easy runs. These are long runs, right? And I always like that the conversation part of it is like sometimes nasal breathing. I will say the nasal breathing for me, just because I'm pretty sure I have a deviated septum and I probably need to get this fixed. I feel like sometimes, just based off what the technology says, when I can't nasal breathe anymore, I'm personally think I'm just getting maybe into zone two. I don't think I'm ever even leaving zone two before I can lose the ability to nasal breathe. Now I can hold a zone two as far as like what my tech will tell me, and I can still have a conversation or sing on a run. You know, like singing was always, I made a video about this years ago. It was like, if you're on a run, can you sing your songs the entire time? Not that you should, because you'll probably look like a psychopath in the running, but like, could you hold that? So pick those as the foundation to everything that you're doing, right? Now, when you do some runs, there's going to be some like for when you think about like threshold type of runs, this is what they call like comfortably hard, right? Which is probably getting closer to that 3 and the 4 range of things. Threshold runs should probably be done once a week, right? Maybe like 2 rounds of 20 minutes or 1 round of 30 to 40 minutes a day, right? Or a week, I'm sorry. Zone 5 is going to be the really, really, really high intensity work. And that's going to be something that requires a lot more recovery. And obviously, from a duration perspective, you're thinking maybe shooting for like 30 minutes a week at max, right? Like you really, really don't need to be doing a lot. And the one thing that I will say with a lot of like the group class movement that's happened over the last decade or two, when you think about Orange Theory, when you think about berries, I think F45 maybe is a little bit better, but like things like that, they're selling conditioning as kind of being the main chunk of what they talk about, right? And because there is something, you know, perspective wise as a human, that when we sweat or when we're huffing and puffing during a workout, that means that is a good workout. Now, here's the thing I will want to remind you. That does not mean that is the only sign of a good workout. There is workouts where you can not even necessarily get your heart rate up much at all because it's a strength training workout with a lot of rest. That's going to be great for muscle development or great for strength or power, right? There's going to be things that are going to be good for mobility. So when you think about training in a more holistic perspective, understand that conditioning is kind of one aspect of it, but then there's the strength and there's the movement and mobility. Selfishly, obviously, as a quote unquote more functional approach to training, I think there should be a balance of all those things, right? And I'm going to kind of tie in some of the strength training in a second of like how I think the approach should be. So zone 2, like I said that. Now, when we get to the HIIT stuff, right? What is HIIT, right? We have next Wednesday in our program for the conditioning, we have 10-calorie sprints on the Airdyne bike, max effort. You're obviously going for the quickest time on there. And then you're going to rest 5x. 4 to 5x is kind of what we're doing. Honestly, sometimes I would promote more, but from a class structure, just being mindful of time, I have to be aware of that because some people, a 10-calorie sprint might take you 20 seconds, right? So it's like if you think 20 seconds, that means that I should be taking 100 seconds of rest, right? So we're thinking about what is that? A minute and 40 seconds total of rest. And it's kind of like low rep training. This is a great way to think about your HIIT of like how much rest should I be doing in between a 50-yard dash or a 100-meter sprint, or for some of us a 200, you know, whatever you're kind of doing as far as the structure of the training. But when you think about interval training, the reason why intervals are so important, it's kind of like the rest in between the sets of working, right? So let's just make something up. Last cycle, we did a more functional bodybuilding approach, right? So you did the typical hypertrophy training where it's 8 to 12 reps or sometimes up to 15 reps. So a little bit more volume, a little bit more isolation movements. For things like that, you can get away with 40 seconds to a minute and a half of rest, right? But ideally, like probably the sweet spot being like rest for a minute. So you don't need as much rep as you add volume, right? Which is interesting because it sounds backwards. Like in my head, I would think if I have to squat 10 times, I would think I would want more rest. Versus me squatting 2 times as heavy as I can, I think that would need less rest. But the thing that you need to remember is the energy system that you're using, right? So when you get into zone 4, zone 5 type of work, this is very glycolytic, right? Meaning you're burning carbs and sugar as your fuel source, right? So you have a very, very short like duration window that you can use this energy source before you have to tap into other sources, which is why you cannot hold. If you ran your quickest 40-yard dash, you cannot hold that for 400 meters. You cannot hold that for a mile. You know, that's why I always think about like endurance athlete or marathon runners, like the people that are running the 2-hour marathon, that I think it's like a 4-minute something mile time. That is like unheard of on how crazy that is to maintain that pace. So granted, this is the top 1% of the top 1% that we're talking about here. For most of us, we're never even going to entertain the idea of breaking that even on a 100-meter dash for our pace. You know, that was I was talking to Cisco. This is probably like a month ago. He was doing some interval training on the track. And I was telling him, I was like, isn't it crazy that I think he was doing 200s or 400-meter times, whatever it was, intervals, that even your fastest 200 or 400-meter is still slower than someone or the top marathon pace, right? Not what you did for a quarter mile or an eighth of a mile, but what someone did for 26.2 miles, right? So obviously, like I said, that's a freak of nature when you think about the training volume that's required and the genetics that are required to get someone to that level. Now, for most of us, we think about why would I be using cardio in the first place, right? And I think, and this is even a conversation I personally have with myself is like, cardio for most people is not enjoyable. A lot of people, when I sit down with them during an assessment, they go, I just don't enjoy cardio. It's just not as exciting to me. And I'm like, I get it. I'm the same way, right? I like to choose cardio that I think is more interactive or, more integrated into something that's borderline distracting, meaning I would much rather go play sports for an hour. I went skimboarding yesterday in the morning. So it's like me running 45 minutes to an hour of like sprint, sprint, rest, sprint, sprint, rest, right? Like that's a form of interval training. So I think like, there's creative ways to integrate cardiovascular and aerobic training or anaerobic training in ways that don't feel as daunting or boring. I am not someone that you will ever catch me on an elliptical just doing an hour or something. There are some people that are like, I love elliptical. It's the easiest. It's the most approachable. I can zone out. I can listen to music. I can watch an iPad and watch a movie on an elliptical. So like, just understand, like, meet yourself where you're at. And like the biggest thing to understand is also that like, it's more important for you to be doing it than it is for you to be doing something that you don't enjoy. So I'd much rather you pick a modality or pick an approach that is a little bit more approachable versus you being like, well, Corey says running's better because of my hips, but I fucking hate running, right? Because like the compliance over time or sustainability of you doing so is probably not going to be there. So just like really, really low rep strength training for power development or strength development, we would say, I was talking to other Francisco, and he's getting ready for a powerlifting competition in December. And it's like, he'll squat, do 2, 3, 4, 5 reps, and then I'll sit down for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, sometimes 5 minutes. And the goal is because you want to recover, right? Like these systems that you use at a really, really high output also need time to recover, right? So that's why it's in the same kind of approach for HIIT training is like if I'm doing a 10-second sprint on an Airdyne bike or a 10-second sprint on the track, I want to make sure that I'm giving myself 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10x the rest. Right. So it's like a 10-second sprint, multiply that by 5. Like I should be at least giving myself a minute. And honestly, depending on the output or the modality, probably even more. Now that, like I said, ideal sweet spot is 30 minutes. So if you look at kind of the sweet spot of like, okay, zone 2 work and zone 4 and 5 work, I want about 90 minutes a week of some type of zone 2. And I want about maybe 20 to 30 minutes. And ideally kind of, if we can, getting closer to 30 minutes to zone 4, zone 5. I'll tell you this from my own experience. I train for sure 3 times a week, but ideally 4 times a week in the gym. More strength stuff, very, very small amount of conditioning. I like to try to get my conditioning in other aspects. So skimboarding, I did a little hour of like some Muay Thai work and hitting the pads with Billy last week. So I like to kind of mix those things up. My Whoop says that I'm in the single digits for the minutes this week that I've had, or last week, I'm sorry, with the total recap of actual zone 4 plus. Like it's hard to get there and you really do have to be intentional. From a VO2 max perspective, it's the best bang for your buck, right? Zone 2, I'm definitely a little bit better at, but even some of the stuff that I thought was zone 2, according to my Whoop, is not. Like I have to actually still even be getting to higher heart rates. Now, the thing to remember is like, can you make strength training more aerobic by nature? And the answer is yeah, shorten your rest time, add volume, do trisets, do giant sets, do, supersets, like do some more circuit-based stuff. So you can do that. I just think like the biggest objective from the goal of going to the gym is getting stronger and moving better, right? So if you're making your training more conditioning focused, then you're kind of taking away from the idea of like it optimizing for strength or hypertrophy of building muscle. So that's where there needs to be kind of some nuance and some separation between these kind of modalities of training. Is like, I think they should be stacked on top of each other. But what I mean by stacked on top of each other is like they're still separate from each other. Like when I go to the gym, I want to go to the gym to enhance my mobility and my strength, right? Or power, performance, whatever that might be. When I do my aerobic training or conditioning training, I want to be something that's actually going to improve my aerobic capacity or my lactate threshold, and my really, really high output abilities. So the thing to remember is like your conditioning level is something that can change drastically really, really fast with a lot of just consistency behind it. I probably my entire life until I got out of high school, I was always really, really good at running, right? I was naturally someone that I think was more quicker and agile as far as sports go, but I was doing cross country. I was running a lot. I was biking a lot. I was surfing a lot. So I had just really, really good endurance still at that time. for myself, right? Subjectively, not compared to maybe other people, but like, for the most part, I was in a really, really good place. Then I kind of took a break, right? Like conditioning, I had exposure through CrossFit. I did boxing for a year, a couple times a week. So I had those like other elements, but I really never made it a big part. Then the pandemic happened and I started getting back into my running. And it was interesting. It's like my runs were going from high 8-minute miles down to mid to low 8 to high 7s to mid 7s. And I started getting down to low 7-minute miles like pretty quick. Right. I remember even testing my mile time. I don't think I ever broke 6 during the pandemic, but I got it back down to like the low 6. So like, you could do it really, really quickly. The hard part is just getting over the hurdle of anything in life, is just getting the consistency of getting started. Right. So when you think about optimal programming for you guys, just to kind of tie in the strength training part, I ideally like every client to be training, and myself to be training strength work, mobility work 3 times a week. I personally like to integrate my mobility and my strength training kind of together. Like I said, I want to go to the gym and I want to optimize for building as much muscle as possible, or preserving, depending on where I'm at in life, and keeping my performance and output as far as speed and strength there too, right? But I never really want to compensate that for the way I move. For me personally, my training goal is like, I want to live a long time. I want to have good energy. I want to feel good. I want to look good. But I also, more importantly, I just want to support the other things that I'm doing. I want to be better at golfing. I want to be better at skimboarding. I want to be better at Muay Thai or boxing. I want like whatever other thing I'm doing outside of quote unquote the gym, I want my training to support that. Now, from a health perspective, like the one thing I will tell you since I started the Whoop back up again is like my resting heart rate is probably about 10 to 15 beats per minute higher than where it was when I was during the pandemic, when I was running consistently, when I stopped running the Whoop. And it goes to show you, like, honestly, lifestyle wasn't that much different. If anything, I was probably more stressed at that point, just because it was the damn pandemic and I didn't have a business to go to. But I was running a lot. I was still drinking a lot. Honestly, I was probably drinking more just because I had nothing to do with my life. But my HRV and my heart rate were drastically in a better place. So it kind of goes to show you that, like, it's interesting that we think about all these other things that we try to do to optimize resting heart rate or heart rate variability. I'll touch on this in a second. We think about, okay, like, yes, like drinking has a very detrimental effect on your heart rate at night and your heart rate variability and recovery and sleep. Obviously some foods, the stress levels that you're dealing with, all those things. But for all that being there still, when I was in really, really good aerobic shape and doing a lot of cardio at the time and a lot of running at the time, I was doing a decent amount of biking too, but a lot more running. My heart rate was getting down to the low 50s, high 40s, right? At night. Now it's like I'm at like low 60s, mid 60s, right? And it just goes to show you that it's interesting that, like, without changing a lot of the other variables, just by removing the consistency of aerobic training, how drastic that was, right? Heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is a little subjective, right? So it's not really necessarily like a quote unquote, like a really good place to be. Like for someone my age, based off the research, if you're lower than 40, that's something you really need to give some attention to. If you're between 40 to 60, not a bad place, but it's got some work. If you're getting to the 60 to 80, you're in a really good place. If you're 80 plus, you're in a fantastic place, an excellent place to be. Heart rate variability is basically the variability between heartbeats. We want variability, right? What that shows us is basically it's a sign of where your autonomic nervous system is. Meaning if you're more parasympathetic, your heart rate variability is going to be higher. If you're more sympathetic or stressed, or not recovering well, or not sleeping well, or overtraining, your heart rate variability drops. So it is an interesting data point to look at, that if you are tracking that consistently, if my HRV is continually trending down, yeah, maybe I need a deload. Maybe I need a little time off. Maybe I need a little recovery. Maybe I need more zone 2. If my heart variability is trending up, then it's like, cool, I can actually kind of gas pedal down, shift it into the next gear, maybe train a little bit harder. Now, you want to balance it between the objective and subjective, but like those are things to pay attention to. But understand that the relationship also between strength training and aerobic training and your cardiovascular training are bidirectional, meaning your cardiovascular training is actually going to improve your strength training to a point. There is context. Doing too much of that is going to hinder this, but also doing too much of strength training is going to hinder this. So there is a balancing act, and I think this is seasonal depending on where you're at with your goals. But you're going to recover faster by having good aerobic capacity, right? But you're also going to be able to run faster, right, when you have good strength training, which is why we take a lot of runners or triathletes, put them into some strength training 2 or 3 times a week, and the running improves, right? But this is also why I can take somebody from, a bodybuilder or a strength person, I can give them a little bit more aerobic training, and their training improves, or the recovery improves, or their output improves. So no matter what, I think it is definitely something that's an essential piece to everyone's training, but how you structure it is going to be important. But biggest takeaway for everyone, just to kind of wrap today up, keep the steps as the foundation for everything. Keep zone 2 the majority of your training. I would say about 80% of your training, conditioning, or cardio wise should be zone 2, should be lower effort. And then about 20% of it should be really, really high intensity stuff, right? Like as much output until you feel like, we call it seeing the pain cave, or you're kind of seeing stars a little bit. You want to be able to get your place that. You want to redline your body every once in a while, but you also need to be very, very careful on how you structure, because too much of that over time is going to be detrimental, right? Having really, really high intensity with lots of recovery and intervaling it that way is going to be a great way to do that. So this is why using technology or using timer or using track, where you can kind of have fixed distances, fixed times, or fixed output, is a great way to kind of control that stuff, right? So hope you guys enjoy that one. If you guys are somebody that's coming to the gym and you're looking to add a little bit more aerobic training or cardio, my biggest piece of advice I can give you is, if you're coming to a double strength day or even a strength and conditioning day, what I would suggest is jump on a rower, a bike, a skier, a jump rope, a sled, or do a light run after. That's going to be easy, and do that for 10, 15, 20 minutes, right? I think starting your day off in the morning, even with a little bit of this, I used to do that all the time during men's physique training. Even from a weight loss perspective or fat loss perspective, just one thing that I actually almost forgot is, like, aerobic training is more fat oxidation, meaning the amount of calories by percentage from fat is going to be a lot higher when you're doing low level stuff. Not the total calories, the percentage of the calories you're burning. Now, total calories, obviously, you're going to burn more the more intense something is, but it's going to be more carbohydrates and glycogen that we're using as a fuel source. So you're tapping into a different energy system. But like I said, if you're doing this after classes, or if you're someone that's not even at FL and you're doing your own workouts, add a little bit of cardio post-workout. And I would always do it post. Don't do it pre, because you don't want to fatigue yourself at the gym. Your goal at the gym is output and building strength, right? Or building muscle. So always do it after and make sure it's kind of low level. Cool. Hope this guys help.